This week, we begin the 14th week of the semester. We have just 1 week of lecture left and then finals week. We do not have a final exam in this class. Instead, I give you the entire week to be able to work on your final project. Hopefully, you've been working on it up until this point, but if you haven't, you'll have the extra finals week in this class to work on that assignment. This week, we're going to learn about some of the subfields of psychology that many of you are more familiar with. Many of these areas of expertise emerged in the mid-1900s. This lecture is divided into 5 parts. We will begin with cognitive psychology, then we will learn about neuroscience, perceptual psychology, social psychology, and we will finish with personality psychology. Let's start with cognitive psychology, take a look at Jean Piaget and some of the other early cognitive psychologists. We have spent the entire semester learning about psychology in the 1800s, in the early 1900s. Now we're going to look at how psychology developed in the mid-1900s. From cognitive psychology, we get neuropsychology, perceptual psychology, then social and personality psychology. Cognitive psychology came first, and if you remember, cognitive psychology is related to Gestalt psychology, which was around in the late 1800s, early 1900s. At this point in the semester, you probably recognize how important it is to consider the zeitgeist, the climate of the times, in order to truly understand any historical event. So what was going on in the middle of the 1900s that contributed to the rise of these 5 subfields? This was a time of great social change, of rebellion, of challenging the institutions, of fighting for justice for one's group. In this photo, there are 2 major social events depicted: the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. Some Americans protested racial and gender discrimination. Other people protested the Vietnam War. Some people protested both. Because the general public was concerned about these issues, psychologists became concerned about these issues. All 5 of these fields contributed to our study of these very important social issues in the 1950s and 1960s. Not only were psychologists studying topics of interest, but the general public was looking for more options, looking for change, looking for something different, looking for other answers that maybe they had never heard before. Psychologists in these 5 fields helped feed people's curiosity about themselves, about their friends, their family, their groups, other people in other cultures. It was during this time that these 5 fields were met with open arms. If it had been earlier in the century, these 5 fields would have had to compete with behaviorism, which was very popular in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. They would have had to compete with functionalism, psychoanalysis, humanistic psychology in the 1950s. One of the other things that contributed to the development of cognitive psychology was that in the mid-1900s, some psychologists were concerned that behaviorism, operant conditioning principles, could not fully explain all human behavior. Language was one of the issues that many of them brought up. We do not learn language solely through rewards and punishment. There are other processes at play, and behaviorism just couldn't fully explain those processes. In response, several individuals began to study language and other forms of human development. People like Piaget, Bartlett, Broadbent, Miller. These individuals helped bring about cognitive psychology, but it didn't get its official name until 1967, when Ulrich Neisser published his book and officially gave it that name. All of this was happening during a time when the federal government was trying to compete with the Soviet Union. So the government was willing to invest more money into scientific research. Cognitive psychologists took advantage of this, applied for grants. That grant money helped fund their research, which helped expand this subfield of psychology. The momentum that the field experienced in the mid-1900s continued into the late 1900s, in part because neuropsychologists came up with all kinds of new ways of measuring brain activity. I've been talking about cognitive psychology for a few minutes now. Let's take a look at a definition. It is the scientific study of mental processes and mental operations, the study of how our mind works. Cognitive psychologists do not focus on emotions. They do not focus on behavior. It doesn't mean they don't study them or they don't measure them. It just means these two areas are not the focus of their attention. They are concerned with the C of the ABCs, A being affect, emotions, B, behavior, C, cognition. Perception, intelligence, creativity, decision-making. You can study some of these topics from a different perspective, but these topics you will often find in the cognitive psychology journals, in the cognitive psychology textbooks. If you've taken cognitive psychology here, you know that these are some of the chapters in your book. Cognitive psychologists might ask questions like, how reliable is our memory? How does implicit bias impact our decisions? How do we create new ideas? How do we create new ideas in groups? All of these questions and many, many more would be of concern to a cognitive psychologist. Cognitive psychologists were not the only ones who were interested in cognition in the mid-1900s. Cognitive science is the name of the broader field that developed at the same time cognitive psychology developed. This is another one of the factors that allowed this subfield to develop at the time that it did. Cognitive psychologists were not the only ones who were interested in cognition. There were others, anthropologists, educators. Many people were interested in how do people think and how does that thinking, how does cognition impact how they relate to other people, how they learn, how they make decisions, how creative they are. How can we replicate that with artificial intelligence? Jean Piaget was one of the earliest contributors to cognitive psychology. He's also one of the more famous psychologists. I'm sure many of you recognize his name. He was born in Switzerland and trained at the University of Neuchâtel. He earned his PhD in biology in 1918. He contributed an enormous amount of information in terms of human development to the field. He was very popular, very well liked. He spent most of his career studying human development in children and in adults. Now, his work was not popular in the United States until the 1960s. He was wildly popular in Europe, but it wasn't until many decades after he published his work, the work that we are all familiar with, it wasn't until several decades after that work had been published that he became popular in the United States. Two reasons for this. One, his publications had not yet been translated into English. And number two, in the 1930s, American psychologists were obsessed with behaviorism, which didn't leave a lot of room at that time for other ideas to gain any traction. By the end of the 20th century, he was the second most cited psychologist of the 1900s, just one spot behind B.F. Skinner. That just goes to show how popular he was, how much he contributed. I don't give him enough credit in this class, I will admit. The year after Piaget earned his PhD, he met Theodore Simon, who introduced him to Alfred Binet. For several years, Piaget worked for Binet at one of his institutions where they tested the verbal intelligence of school-aged children. He interviewed large numbers of children and then compared their answers to adults' answers to the same questions. He concluded, as we all know, that children and adults think very differently. Their cognition is different, both qualitatively and quantitatively. He was also one of the first individuals to suggest that children, people, are active learners, that people actively seek out new knowledge and try to learn. The brain does that automatically. Up until this point, many people suggested that learning just happens. It's sort of this passive process. Remember when we talked about latent learning? Sometimes learning can be passive, absolutely. But Piaget believed children are more active in that process. They make decisions, they have preferences, what they pay attention to, what they perceive, all of that makes a difference in terms of how they develop into adults. After fine-tuning his ideas, he published them in 1936. He created a 4-stage theory of cognitive development to try to explain how children's cognition in childhood develops into the cognition we typically see with adults. How does that change happen? Here are Piaget's 4 stages. His first stage is the sensory motor stage and lasts from birth until about 2 years of age. During this time, babies rely on physical action and reflexes to learn about their environment. They pick things up, they smell them, they stare at them, they put them in their mouths and drool all over them. They use their hands, their feet, and their senses to learn about their world. In the next stage, which lasts from about 2 to 7 years of age, the pre-operational stage, children begin to represent their world with symbols, objects, names, words, descriptions. In the third stage, the concrete operational stage, which lasts from 7 to 11 or 12 years of age. During this stage, children can think more logically about concrete objects. They aren't masters of abstract information, which is why we don't ask third graders to study chemistry and physics. Some of them can, but the majority of children that age are just not able to wrap their brains around the abstract ideas of natural science. During the fourth and final stage, which lasts from pre-adolescence all the way into adulthood, during this stage, children learn how to think more abstractly, more logically. Overall, their cognitive ability is much closer to that of an adult than it has ever been before. Sir Frederick Bartlett was an experimental psychologist in England. His work did not become popular in the United States until the 1960s, just like with Jean Piaget. Bartlett was focused on memory, cognition. He studied animal learning and pilot fatigue. He was interested in how the mind gets tired and how the mind tries to fight being tired. He suggested we organize information, our experiences, our perceptions. We organize that information into groups, units. He called those units schemata collectively. Each one was referred to as a schema. He said our memory has a schema for nearly everything we come into contact with. We all have a schema for school, for work, for friend, dog, cat, pet, hobby, Netflix, you name it. We all have a way of thinking about each one of those topics. So think about dog schema. The way that you think about dogs is very much based on your life experiences. If you've had positive experiences like I have, you probably love dogs. So when I say the word dog, or when I hear the word dog, I have positive thoughts, positive feelings. If you don't like dogs, when I say dog, or when you hear dog, you probably have negative thoughts, negative experiences. So he recognized that everyone has a slightly different schema for any one topic. The word dog means something slightly different to each one of us. People with different experiences will have different schemata. Here is an example of a schema for English teacher. Now, when I say English teacher, what comes to your mind probably won't match exactly what you see on the screen, and that's okay. People with different experiences will have different schema, will have different schemata. The schema for English teacher that you see here involves everything from that person's training to the different parts of their job to the different tests that they need to be able to pass. It's got salary information. The topic of English teacher might bring something totally different to your mind. You might think about children, you might think about books, writing, essays. It depends on your experiences. So how did he figure this out? He brought participants into his lab and asked them to read a story, The War of the Ghosts. I have a copy of the original story here. Take a moment to read it and then push play. He had them read the story and then recall as much as they possibly could after reading the story. He did this several times with each participant. He had them come back several weeks apart, recall the information. We call this the method of repeated reproduction. Someone is asked to reproduce a story or something they were asked to memorize, and they're asked to reproduce it repeatedly, several times. The story, The War of the Ghosts, is a Native American folk tale, and his participants were English. As you can imagine, the story was very different from anything that his participants had ever read. It was very new to them. He predicted that some parts of this story would not make sense to his participants. That was done on purpose. He wanted to see how they would reconstruct their memory of the story. Each time he interviewed them, they remembered less and less of the story. They remembered bits and pieces, but their minds, their brains filled in a lot of the blanks with information from, you guessed it, their own cultures, with information that made sense to them, with information from their schemata. For instance, the phrase, something black coming out of his mouth, became foaming at the mouth. In Native culture, something black coming out of the mouth is a metaphor for death. But English people didn't recognize this, didn't understand this, so they translated it to foaming at the mouth. And he had several participants change that part of the story into foaming at the mouth. If it happens once with one participant, okay, that's probably chance. But if you start to notice a pattern where individuals from one culture are making the same exact mistake, you're onto something. So he realized many of his participants were filling in the blanks that they didn't remember with information from their own lives, information from their own culture. During World War II, Donald Broadbent studied selective attention and discovered that humans have a really difficult time trying to pay attention to two simultaneous messages. If you've got two people talking to you at the same time, which is often the case when you have a young child with you, they want to talk to you at the same time that you're talking to other adults. It's really difficult for any human being to truly listen to both messages. Our brains are designed to handle one message at a time. When we do hear two messages, we tend to filter one of them out, try to ignore it, and select the other one to pay attention to, selective attention. He called it the cocktail party effect. If you've ever been at a party where you're having a conversation with someone and from way across the room, you hear your name mentioned and turn your attention to it, that is the cocktail party effect in full force. Being able to pay attention to a second message and turn your attention to that second message over the first message is a form of selective attention, being able to ignore one and select the other. Then in 1956, George Miller suggested that our memory is limited in the amount of information that it can store. Through a series of cleverly designed experiments, he concluded that the average person can remember 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. That is anywhere between 5 and 9 units. He had participants memorize lists of words and found they were able to remember more words when they chunked some of them together. If you're trying to remember your grocery list, it makes more sense for your brain if you chunk items that are related together. So for instance, instead of trying to remember orange juice and water separately as two different items, you would chunk them together and try to remember that orange juice and water, they're both liquids, you need both of them. That's one chunk instead of two. Now that you have a better understanding of how cognitive psychology developed, let's turn our attention to neuropsychology, a related field. We will look at the contributions of Lashley and Hebb in neuropsychology. Neuropsychology is related to cognitive psychology. Neuropsychology is the scientific study of the relationship between the nervous system and both cognition and behavior, between the nervous system and cognition, between the nervous system and behavior, both of those things. For instance, neuropsychologists might ask questions like, what does the brain do when we speak? What does the brain do when we run a marathon? What does the nervous system do when we study for an exam? What does the nervous system do when we're asleep? All of these questions might be of interest to them. This subfield of psychology is also known as physiological psychology or neuroscience. When I was an undergraduate student, I worked with 2 neuroscientists and learned how to use some pretty cool technology. The term neuropsychology was first used in the 1910s and then popularized by Lashley in the 1930s and Hebb in the 1940s. During the time that neuropsychology, cognitive psychology, and the other types of psychology were just beginning to emerge, there were several people outside of the field of psychology who were developing, creating, inventing new types of technology that could be used to measure the activity of the nervous system of the brain. In 1924, the Electroencephalogram, the EEG, was invented. That same year, it was discovered that the two hemispheres of the brain communicate through the corpus callosum, which is inside but between the two. In 1936, Freeman conducted the first human lobotomy. We learned about him in last week's lecture. In 1953, rapid eye movement was discovered, the notion that during different stages of sleep, the brain activities associated with that stage vary. Then it was discovered in 1962 that the two brain hemispheres are responsible for different functions of the human. In 1972, magnetic resonance imaging, the MRI, was discovered. Later that year, the CT scan, the computed tomography scan, was invented. The year after that, the PET scan, positron emission tomography, was invented. Several decades later, and of course, there were many other types of technology being created, updated during this time period, but I wanted to mention that in the early 90s, the functional MRI is commonly used today in neuroscience and neuropsychology. On the next couple of slides, I want to show you what the output looks like for some of these different types of technology. Here are several examples of brain wave activity that we might see if we used the EEG. This is an example of what the output looks like for an MRI. Here is an example of what is created by conducting a CT scan. And finally, we have the output from a PET scan. The areas in red are where the most activity is occurring. The areas in purple and blue and black are the areas where there is the least amount of activity. So you can see the difference between hearing words, seeing words, speaking words, generating words. These different actions require different parts of the brain. A PET scan shows us which areas are activated during specific activities. I'll say it one more time, neuropsychology developed along with the technology. These different techniques that I've shown you on the last few slides are still used today in some form, especially in neuroscience research. Again, as an undergraduate student, I used the EEG with more than 100 different participants. You place a cap on the head, it has electrodes, they have to stay wet, so you're always putting stuff in people's head, it goes in their eyes, and you got to dab it. It was a very time-intensive study to conduct using the EEG cap, but it was really interesting to get to see how different people's brains react to different kinds of stimuli with such a simple, we didn't have to cut holes in anybody's head. We didn't have to damage any kind of brain. We were able to measure their activity safely, painlessly, fairly, relatively easily. Carl Lashley was an experimental psychologist known for his learning and memory studies in the early to mid-1900s. He purposely destroyed different amounts of cortex in rats and observed how ablation, the term for doing this, how it affected the rat's ability to learn and remember. After damaging their brains, he put the rats in 3 different types of mazes. they differed in complexity. He found that learning didn't seem to be localized in any one part of the brain. All of the rats were able to learn even after having parts of their cortex damaged. He called this equipotentiality, the notion that when one part of the brain is damaged, the surrounding areas compensate for the loss of function. They make up for the injury. His studies provided evidence against the argument of localization. If you remember, one of the reasons that phrenology lost support in the scientific community was because some individuals were able to show that certain functions are in fact localized. Lashley was able to show that learning in general is not as localized as some of the other more specific functions that other researchers had focused on years before. He was focused on learning. He looked at how learning is impacted, and the brain is able to make up for some damage, some injury by allowing areas near the damage to take over that function. He also came up with the principle of mass action and suggested the amount of damage is proportional to the amount of learning, to how well the animal learns. In other words, the more brain tissue he damaged, the more learning was impaired. Donald Hebb was another early neuropsychologist. He wanted to fully integrate physiology and psychology. He is well known for studying the relationship between the brain and behavior. In 1949, Hebb published his book, The Organization of Behavior. In this book, he suggested the learning process occurs through the growth of physical structures within the brain. Learning equals physical brain growth. According to him, thinking occurs through two structures: cell assemblies and phase sequences. You can see illustrations of these physical structures here at the bottom of the screen. These illustrations came from his book from 1949. The most basic unit of the nervous system is the cell assembly. It is a set of neurons that have become associated with one another because they've been activated at the same time through repeated experiences over time. So the most basic structure of the nervous system changes as we learn and gain experience exposure. Phase sequences are groups of cell assemblies, groups that once again become connected because they are activated at the same time, over and over again. You can see that in the mid-1900s, we were becoming more familiar with how the brain and the nervous system actually work, how they function, and how they relate to behavior. In the last 75 years, we have made even more progress in the field of neuropsychology. I wanted to show you in this section just a high-level overview of two of the most important pioneers in this field and some of the technology that we use to research topics of interest. Now let's take a look at perceptual psychology and learn about the contributions of two individuals, James Gibson and Eleanor Gibson. They were married. Perceptual psychology is a cousin of Gestalt psychology and cognitive psychology. It's the scientific study of how the brain interprets sensory information, how the brain takes information from our environment and turns it into meaningful information. Today, you might take a class called Sensation and Perception. It involves all 5 of the senses and tries to explain how exactly sound, light, motion, how the stimuli in our environment, we try to figure out exactly how that information gets from outside of us to awareness. How do we hear sound? How does the wave get into our ear? How do the mechanisms within our ear translate that sound wave into what we know as sound? How does all of that happen? This would be the focus of a perceptual psychologist. One of the earliest pioneers in perceptual psychology was James Gibson. He was an American psychologist who focused most of his research on visual perception. He earned his PhD from Princeton University in 1928 and started teaching at Smith College. If you remember from several weeks ago, Smith College was one of the first colleges dedicated to women. It was opened in the 1800s. He met his wife, Eleanor Gibson, at Smith College, where she was studying. James joined the Army in 1941 and served in World War II. During his service, he created selection tests for pilots, and he also created short training films for different departments, different personnel. Through his experience in the Army, he learned to appreciate practical research. He promoted the study of ecological perception. He suggested that researchers try to study perception in real-world situations as it occurs in real life. For instance, in order to understand how a pilot perceives their environment while they are flying the aircraft, it would be best if we could join them in the cockpit and observe, measure perception in the cockpit. Of course, we can't do that as researchers. It makes me sick thinking about it. Instead, we bring pilots into the lab and try to replicate the real-world environment as best as we can. We do this in part because early researchers like James Gibson brought that to our attention, really stressed the importance of making sure that the artificial lab environment that we create is as realistic, is as representative as it can be, as is affordable. In 1932, James and Eleanor met at Smith College and eventually were married. She went on to make a name for herself in the subfield of perceptual psychology. She studied a wide variety of topics, but is best known for some of her work in visual perception. She earned her PhD from Yale University in 1938. In 1949, the couple moved to New York State so that James could start teaching at Cornell University. For 16 years, Eleanor worked at Cornell University as an unpaid research assistant. They had a policy against paying both a husband and wife to work at the university. She was allowed to work there, but only as a volunteer. Can you imagine? 16 years she worked for free. That's dedication. In 1969, much of her work was republished in a collection. Eleanor spent much of her career promoting the scientific method, so much so that in 1992, President George H.W. Bush awarded her the National Medal of Science. You can see a picture of the two of them here on the slide. One of Eleanor's most famous studies was her visual cliff study that she conducted with Richard Walk. Many of you are probably familiar with this study. just not with the person who was in charge of running it. They designed this experiment to study the development of depth perception. They were curious about the age at which people, babies, begin to perceive depth. They started by studying animals. In their rat studies, they found that as soon as a baby rat was able to move around, that rat was able to perceive depth. Mobility, depth perception appeared to develop at the same pace in baby rats. So then they wanted to study humans. They built a contraption like the one you see here in the image. It was a large box with a full sheet of plexiglass over the top. So the baby cannot fall at all. The mom, the parent, it was usually a mom, but the parent was always right there watching the child, observing the child, while the researchers stood behind the mother and instructed the mother what to do, what to say, what not to do, what not to say. From a child's perspective, there is a cliff at the edge of the checkered pattern. When the infant gets up to the edge, the cliff, the infant has to decide, do I want to keep going or do I want to stop? They took a group of babies that could not crawl and set them right where you see the baby in the image. Many of these really young infants would reach for their mother. They would look down, recognize the floor, see the pattern, and then reach for mother. Gibson and Walk concluded that these infants were unable to perceive depth. Then they studied a group of infants who were able to crawl. They would crawl up to the edge of the cliff, look down, recognize the pattern, and not dare cross that cliff. No amount of coaxing, candy, bribes from the mother convinced those older children to move across the cliff. Why? Because at that age, by the time they learned how to crawl, they had developed depth perception. In the fourth section of this lecture, let's look at how social psychology developed by focusing on the contributions from Floyd Alport, Stanley Milgram, and Leon Festinger. Social psychology first began to emerge in the 1920s with Floyd Alport's work. But by the 1950s, it had established itself as a separate, distinct subfield of psychology. Social psychology is the scientific study of individual behavior in social situations. This field considers how people think, feel, and behave when surrounded by other people or when they perceive that other people's opinions, perceptions, ideas, thoughts, actions matter. Many modern historians consider Floyd Alport to be the father, the founder of experimental social psychology. He earned his PhD in 1919 from Harvard University, where he studied with Hugo Munsterberg, like so many other pioneers in the field. After graduating from Harvard, he published his famous social facilitation studies. He compared participants' performance on different tasks when they were alone and when they were in groups. What he found was when other people were present, his participants sometimes performed better than they did when they were alone. More specifically, when his participants were really good at a task, they did better when they had an audience than they did when they were alone. Take a moment to think about something that you are really, really, really good at. That thing that you have so much skill in is something that you could perform really well if you were alone And according to Alport's research, his social facilitation research, you could probably perform that very same task even better if you had an audience, if you had people watching you. He published his social facilitation studies in 1920. Several years later, he published a popular textbook called Social Psychology. Universities across the country adopted it for their social psychology classes. It was used for at least 50 years and is now it was the #1 textbook for more than 50 years and was published in 13 different editions. Look at the edition of your history textbook. Alport's early work in the 1920s paved the way for other researchers to contribute to and grow social psychology. Leon Festinger is one of those individuals. He earned his PhD from the University of Iowa and studied with Kurt Lewin, one of the individuals who moved from Germany to the United States just before World War II. Festinger published his famous theory of cognitive dissonance in 1954. The basic premise of his theory was that all humans seek to maintain balance between their behaviors and their thoughts. If you believe you should exercise, then you exercise. If you believe you shouldn't drink, you shouldn't smoke, then you don't drink, you don't smoke. When there is alignment between attitudes and behavior, we have balance. When there is misalignment, when behaviors and thoughts do not match, he said the result is cognitive dissonance. This tension that we feel when we're aware our actions don't exactly match up with our thoughts. When we don't walk the talk, when we say something but do the opposite. In those situations, cognitive dissonance results and causes tension, causes this uncomfortable state of being. This tension then motivates us to do something about it, to restore balance in some way. There are multiple different options, techniques that humans use. Let's look at an example of cognitive dissonance and then look at some of the strategies people use to deal with the tension. In this example, you can see the behavior on the left and the cognition on the right. Imagine someone who drinks alcohol also knows that drinking alcohol can cause liver disease and other health issues. This conflict between drinking alcohol but knowing that alcohol is not good for the body, this conflict is what causes cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance is the uncomfortable state. To deal with this conflict, one of the things we might do is change the attitude, change the cognition. So we might say to ourselves, drinking only causes problems for people who drink a lot. While that may not be true, the fact that we're now thinking it aligns more with our behavior and reduces that tension. One of the other things we might do is change our perception of our behavior. The first strategy is to change the attitude about the behavior. The second strategy is to change how we think about how we perform the behavior. For example, the person in this example might decide that they don't drink all that much. So this tension isn't a problem because their perception of their own behavior changes. The third thing we can do is minimize the number of options that we have available to us. So we might justify our behavior by saying something like, my friends gave me drinks all night. It wasn't me. I didn't have a choice. I didn't have any say in the matter. This happened to me. That is a way of reducing that tension. The fourth strategy is to minimize the importance of the issue. So instead of dwelling on the negatives of drinking alcohol, instead of feeling guilty, instead of feeling bad about it, we tell ourselves that the issue is not important. We only live once, might as well, let's have fun. Sometimes we do this, of course, even when the issue is important to us, when the issue is important to other people. So I encourage you, the next time you find yourself doing something that you know you shouldn't, think about which of these strategies is playing into your decision-making process. One of the reasons Festinger became so popular in social psychology was because he staged these elaborate experimental situations and relied heavily on deception in order to carry out the situation. He deliberately withheld information from his participants. Sometimes he lied to his participants, all in an effort to maintain the integrity of the experiment. Today, we would not be able to replicate Festinger's studies because it would violate some of the ethical principles we've established since the mid-1900s. In 1964, he quit researching because he got tired of listening to his critics bemoan his use of deception. By the 1970s, social psychology and deceptive experiments were closely tied to one another. Even the general public associated social psychology with things like Zimbardo's prison experiment and Milgram's obedience studies, which we'll talk about next. His work was also important because it helped promote social psychology's reputation as a legitimate science. He tried to increase the amount of control he had in his experiments. One of the things he did was measure a variety of variables, not just the variables of interest. When we analyze the data using statistics, we can control for those external variables. He was very careful about how he manipulated the independent variable. As I mentioned, deception was often involved in the process. He was also very careful about how he measured the dependent variable. He was also among the first generation of psychologists to rely on the ANOVA, the Analysis of Variance, as a way of evaluating the data that results from conducting a psychological study. We often have two groups, the group that we treated, the group that we didn't treat, and we need to figure out if the differences that we're seeing in the Excel sheet that we use today, back then it would have just been ledgers. We're trying to figure out if those differences between the two groups are meaningful differences. Did those differences happen by chance, or did those differences happen because there's something there, there's some phenomenon that we've been able to identify? In 1960, Stanley Milgram earned his PhD from Harvard University, where he studied with Gordon Alport, the brother of Floyd Alport. As a Jewish man, Milgram was influenced by the Holocaust and wanted to focus his research on the topic. In the 1950s, Osh had started studying conformity using his line length task. Milgram had what he thought was a better way of studying what he called obedience. He published the results of the initial study in 1963 and then conducted 17 more studies, which he published in a book in 1974. 18 studies in total. But the main question he was trying to answer with his first study was how much voltage would the teacher apply before disobeying the authority figure's orders. And I'll explain on the next slide how the experiment worked. His results demonstrated the power of the situation. The notion that sometimes we obey other people when we wouldn't otherwise do so. He was then interested in figuring out in which situations do we tend to obey and in which situations do we tend to disobey. You can see the tie back to the Holocaust. He was trying to figure out why some of the Nazi personnel obeyed their orders. Why didn't more of them disobey? Why did they not refuse to do what they were being asked to do? Like many of the other social psychologists' work in the 1960s and 1970s, his was criticized for his use of deception. He was not entirely honest with his participants, and some of his participants reported unsavory outcomes after participating in his studies. So what did he do to gain this kind of reputation? On Yale University's campus, he recruited 40 men to participate in his first study. The experimenter, who wore a fancy white coat that screamed degrees and authority, asked the participants, who were called teachers, to administer increasingly painful electric shocks to a student. Now, keep in mind, the student was a Confederate. The student worked for Milgram, and the student was never actually shocked. They pre-recorded screams and ouch noises like that so that they could standardize the research process. The teacher was supposed to be teaching the learner groups of words. When the learner got things wrong, the teacher was supposed to shock them with these shocks. Every time the learner got a question wrong, the teacher was supposed to up the voltage. Eventually, the teachers get to the point where the learner, which is just a pre-recorded voice, didn't actually happen. They eventually get to the point where the learner is screaming, "Help me, get me out of here, I have a heart condition, help." Milgram was interested in seeing just how far those teachers would go before they finally said to the experimenter, "I can't do it anymore. He has a heart condition. I can't hurt him. No, I'm not doing this. No, no, no." Well, you can see the results in the chart here. On average, 27 of the 30 total shocks were administered. So on average, most of the potential shocks were given. Even more surprising, 65% of the participants, the teachers, administered all 30 of the shocks, went all the way to the highest voltage possible, which means they heard the learner say, "I have a heart condition, I need help," and they still administered the shocks. After the experimental session, during the debriefing period, some of the teachers reported feelings of extreme guilt, sadness, anxiety. They did not have positive things to say about their participation in the study, what it felt like to be the teacher and to shock someone who had a heart condition. Well, this all begs the question, why? Why did these teachers continue administering shocks with the knowledge that the person they're shocking could die? Why? Milgram concluded it was because of the authority figure. It was because of that experimenter. In follow-up studies, when the experimenter did not wear a white coat, the results did not look as sad as they look here. People did not go as far as they did in the initial study. When he made the experimenter look less authoritative, less powerful, the results again changed. They were in the more positive direction. People disobeyed sooner. Through the 18 different studies, Milgram was able to explore some of the different situations in which people tend to disobey and people tend to obey. One of the most interesting things about this study is that it has been replicated within the ethical boundaries over time and across cultures. Stanley Milgram is best known for his obedience studies, but he did make several other contributions that I just had to show you. He created what we call the lost letter technique. It is a way of studying attitudes by measuring behaviors. He dropped 4 stacks of stamped envelopes in various parts of the city, waiting for people to pick up those letters, drop them in the mailbox, and send them off in the mail. The return address was his address. There was a stamp on the envelope so that all the individual had to do was drop it in the mailbox. He was interested in finding out the percentage of letters that would be returned. On each letter, there was one of 4 groups: medical research associates, friends of the Communist Party, friends of the Nazi Party, and an individual person. After waiting for several weeks and for the letters to return, what he found was very interesting. More than 70% of the letters that were addressed to the medical group or the individual were returned. Less than 30% of the letters addressed to the Communist Party or the Nazi Party were returned. He reasoned that the results reflect people's attitudes just as much as they do the direct behavior, the mailing of the letter, the picking up of the letter and saying, oh, I like that person. I'm going to help out these medical research associates and drop this letter in the mail. People who picked up the other letters and saw that they were addressed to the Communist Party or the Nazi Party did not return, did not drop those letters in the mail because they don't have positive attitudes toward those 2 groups. He also coined the phrase familiar stranger to describe those people that we know, that we're familiar with. Maybe we see them every day, but they're still a stranger to us. We don't know their name. We're not comfortable carrying on a conversation with them. For instance, maybe some of the people who live in your neighborhood, maybe you recognize their car, but you don't know anything about them. You just know what they drive and where they live. They would be a familiar stranger. They're relatively unknown to you, but you're familiar with them. He also studied the small world phenomenon. Many of us call it 6 degrees of separation. What he did was ask a person in Nebraska to send a letter to a specific person in New York City. But the trick was, the letter could not be sent directly to the person. They had to send a letter to someone they knew who might know that person in New York City. Now, for many of us, when we first hear this, we think that's impossible, it would never happen. But guess what? It did, time and time and time again. What would happen is the person in Nebraska would mail a letter to, say, a friend that lives in Missouri who went to New York 10 years ago. Nebraska to Missouri. The person in Missouri may not know the person in New York City, but let's say they have a friend in Chicago who travels there on business all of the time. So that person in Missouri would mail the letter to someone in Chicago. That person in Chicago might mail a letter to someone they met in New York City. Once it gets to New York City, it might just take 1 or 2 more people to make the connection. He did this multiple times with different participants. After he analyzed the data, he found that on average, any two strangers were only separated by 6 social connections. Between Nebraska, which is labeled A in this image, and the person in New York, which is labeled B in the image, there are 6 connections, 6 social connections. It's a small world. In the final section of this lecture, we'll learn about personality psychology and how Murray and Alport contributed to its expansion. Personality psychology is the scientific study of individual differences in regards to personal characteristics. Personality psychologists recognize that in order to understand personality, we really have to get to know the person and understand the person. We refer to this as an idiographic approach because we are focused on the uniqueness of the individual. Psychologists in the other subfields are focused more on how the general population thinks, feels, behaves. Gordon Alport is considered the father of personality theory. His brother Floyd was the father of experimental social psychology. He earned his PhD in 1922 from Harvard University, like so many other early psychologists. He was a big supporter of the idiographic approach. He believed every single person was unique and that in order to help any one person, the therapist needed to understand that person. In 1937, he gave personality psychology its name with his book, Personality, a Psychological Interpretation. Gordon said traits are the most basic unit of personality. Today, many people, even those who don't study psychology, talk about personality traits. That word came from Gordon Alport in the mid-1900s. He introduced several different types of traits: cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits. And I'll just go over them briefly here, give you a chance to kind of think about your own personality and which traits might describe you. Cardinal traits. We usually only have 1 or 2. These are the dominating forces behind our behavior. Think of a word or 2 that describes how you behave in every single situation. It doesn't matter if you're at work, at home, with your friends, with your pet, with your spouse, your children. It doesn't matter who you're with. This word describes you in every situation. Once you find that word is probably one of your cardinal traits, but you, according to Alport, only have 1 or 2 of these most important traits. Then we have what are called central traits. 5 to 10, he really didn't have numbers. He said they were there, but didn't label, you have this many, you have this many. The 5 to 10 themes that also describe your behavior, but not as well as that one word that describes your behavior across all situations. So with central traits, we might use one central trait at home, another central trait at school, another central trait at work. But that central trait is still consistent. We still behave that way consistently across time. And then finally, we have what are called secondary traits. These are the parts of our personality that certainly drive behavior, motivate behavior, guide behavior. But unless you're really, really, really close to someone, they probably wouldn't even realize that these traits are even there. They're secondary because they're almost hidden. The next time someone mentions personality traits, you can thank Gordon Alport. To measure personality, Gordon created a paper and pencil personality test with Philip Vernon in 1931. Together, they believed that they could evaluate someone's personality by measuring their values. Personality is a very abstract concept, and in the early days, theorists struggled with how best to measure it, observe it. Personality technically is behavior over time. How does someone behave across situations, across time? They believed that values were the next best thing. And if they could measure values, they could get a sense of how people behave, think, feel across situations. Which one of these values best describes your personality, how you behave today, tomorrow, yesterday, at home, at school, at work? If you are someone who values theory, then you value discovering the truth. If you value economics, then you want things that are useful, that are practical. If your focus is on aesthetic values, then you care about form, beauty, harmony. If your values center on social relationships, then you seek love, affection, connection with other people. Political values usually drive people to seek power. Religious values drive people to seek unity. So take a moment to think about which one of these values best describes your personality. Here are a few examples from the original paper and pencil test created by Alport and Vernon. Number 3, which of the following individuals do you think should be judged as contributing more to the progress of the human race? A, Aristotle, or B, Abraham Lincoln? With questions 1 and 2, the way that you answer them is a little bit confusing. The instructions are elaborate. The rating scales are not important to our class. I wanted to give you an example of how these two used questions about values. What do you prefer? What do you think? What is your opinion? They tried to measure values as a way of trying to measure personality. Henry Murray is the last psychologist we will talk about in this lecture. He was at odds with many of the other psychologists we've talked about in this class, including the famous historian Boring. They disagreed about the importance of laboratory psychology, of experimental psychology. Remember that so many of the people we've talked about so far were promoting the experimental method. They were all about independent variables, dependent variables, control, procedures, etc. Murray was a big fan of the case study. He preferred to learn about individuals in a more in-depth way. He believed that the best way to treat someone's issues, whether they be related to mental illness or just challenges in life, he believed that the best way to treat those issues was by getting to know the person. Eventually, he created what he called personology, the in-depth study of individual people. When he was at Harvard University, he and Christina Morgan created what they called the Thematic Apperception test. It was another one of the early personality tests, but it wasn't a traditional paper and pencil, fill in a bubble, choose A, B, C, D kind of test. It's what we call a projective test. Let me show you an example of some of the items. Murray and Morgan would show test takers images like the ones you see here. And these 3 examples were part of the original set. So the image that you can see right here, what's going on? What do you think's going on? Now, when we're in class together and there's 50 of you sitting in the audience, I ask this question, I get 10 different answers. No 2 people ever provide the same answer to what is going on in this image. That's the idea. Each one of these images is designed to be somewhat ambiguous. You're not quite sure exactly what's going on. There could be multiple different captions for these images. Sure, the image on the left here, it looks like someone's being cut open, but we don't know if it's a good thing, if it's a bad thing. We don't know why. Who is the person in the foreground? Is that a young person? Is that an older person? Is that an alive person? Is that a dead person? So many questions, right, about these different images. Morgan and Murray would show test takers these images and then observe how the test takers responded. Everything from their nonverbal language to how they respond to the question. So they paid attention to those reactions because the idea was reactions reflect personality. If someone responds in a negative way, maybe that person always responds in a negative way, or most of the time, not always. If someone responds with a curious response, then maybe that person is curious across all situations. This was sort of their thinking. Today, we know that projective tests like this one do not work. Clinical psychologists, counseling psychologists do not usually use projective tests, despite what Hollywood movies might have us think. We tend to rely on other types of tests, but nonetheless, this was one of the earliest ones. The logic behind this connection between someone's response to the items and their personality was that we interpret everything that we come across through our past experiences. So an ambiguous image that we don't know a lot about would be interpreted through our life experiences. If our life experiences have been primarily ABC, then the image will then be evaluated through that ABC lens. Unfortunately, it just doesn't quite work out that way in the real world. They also thought that if they could get their test takers to tell a story about each one of the images, it's not a yes/no answer. They were expected to say a sentence or two. Through that process of explaining what is going on in the photo, telling a story, the researchers hoped that the test takers would relax and it wouldn't feel so sterile. Remember, Murray was not a big fan of the lab and so wanted to give his work and the environment a little bit more of a real feel. That is it for week 14. We have just one more lecture in this class. Next week, in week 15, we will look at some of the more recent trends in the field of psychology.